The Sevier County Courthouse keeps its microfilm archives in a basement room that still smells like developer fluid and old paper, where every local newspaper from 1950 to 1959 sits preserved in careful chronological order, and where a researcher named Patricia Hendricks discovered something impossible during a routine genealogy search in the spring of 2019. She found a man's name appearing in 73 different headlines across those 9 years, covering everything from city council meetings to school fundraisers to traffic accidents to church picnics, always identified as James William Cortland, always described as a prominent local businessman, always photographed in the same dark suit with the same thin mustache. The archive photographs show him shaking hands with mayors, cutting ribbons at new storefronts, speaking at Rotary Club dinners, standing beside construction sites, presenting awards at the high school. Yet when Patricia brought printouts of these headlines to the Sevierville Historical Society, not a single board member recognized his name or his face. The Historical Society has operated continuously since 1953, maintaining careful records of every significant family and business in Sevier County, with membership rolls that include descendants of the town's oldest families and retired educators who taught local history for decades. These are people who can recite the names of every school principal since 1920, who know which families owned which farms before the tourism boom, who remember details about shop owners and factory managers and church deacons from 60 years ago. When Patricia spread the newspaper clippings across the conference table, showing James William Cortland at the dedication of the new water treatment plant in 1952, and at the groundbreaking for the elementary school expansion in 1955, and receiving a Community Service Award in 1958, the room went completely silent in a way that felt less like confusion and more like encountering something fundamentally wrong with reality. No one could explain how a man who appeared more frequently in local news than the actual mayor had left absolutely no trace in living memory or in any record beyond those newspaper pages. Patricia's discovery would have remained a curious anomaly, perhaps attributed to faulty collective memory or incomplete historical records, except that her investigation into James William Cortland revealed something more disturbing than simple absence from modern recollection. The businesses he supposedly owned never appeared in property records. The addresses listed for his various enterprises led to vacant lots or buildings with completely different historical occupants. The organizations he chaired showed no documentation of his leadership in their archived minutes, and most troublingly, the Sevier County Census records from 1950 and 1960 contained no entry for anyone named James William Cortland, despite newspaper articles describing him as a lifelong resident. When Patricia contacted the families of other people photographed alongside Cortland in various newspaper images, she found that several of those individuals were also completely absent from census data and property records, as if an entire subset of Sevierville's population existed only in newspaper coverage and nowhere else in the documented reality of mid-century Tennessee. Subscribe now because the evidence we're about to present suggests this pattern extends far beyond one forgotten businessman, reaching into the fundamental architecture of how small American towns decided who deserved to be remembered and who would be systematically erased from every record except the one they couldn't fully control. Sevierville sits at the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains, a town that spent most of its history serving as a quiet agricultural hub before the tourism explosion of the 1970s transformed the surrounding area into an endless corridor of themed attractions and cabin rentals. The downtown district still preserves its original courthouse square, where a handful of businesses operate in buildings that date back to the 1920s, and where elderly residents gather on benches to watch the sparse traffic roll through on Highway 411. The town maintains a particular kind of American small-town rhythm, where everyone supposedly knows everyone else's family history, where newcomers remain newcomers even after 20 years, where the past feels perpetually present in the stories people tell about how things used to be before the tourists came. This is the kind of place where collective memory functions as social infrastructure, where oral history carries more weight than official documentation, where a person's standing in the community depends largely on how long their family has occupied local space. Yet something broke in that infrastructure during the 1950s, though nobody recognized it at the time, and few people acknowledge it even now that Patricia's research has brought the fracture into sharp relief. The decade after World War II represented a period of significant transition for Sevierville, with new construction projects, expanding civic organizations, growing commercial activity, and increasing integration into regional economic networks. The local newspaper, the Sevier County Times, expanded from a weekly to a twice-weekly publication to cover all this activity, documenting the transformation with extensive photography and detailed reporting about who built what, who served on which committees, who donated to which causes. These newspapers created what appeared to be a comprehensive record of the town's evolution, preserving names and faces and achievements for future generations to study, except that record now appears to contain an entire phantom population of people who never existed in any form outside those printed pages. Patricia initially assumed she had simply encountered gaps in census data or property records, the kind of bureaucratic oversights that occur in any administrative system. But as her investigation expanded across multiple years and multiple individuals, the pattern became too consistent to attribute to clerical error. She found business licenses issued to companies with no corresponding tax records, photographs of ribbon-cutting ceremonies at buildings that were never constructed, mentions of city officials in positions that official municipal records show were held by completely different people, coverage of community events organized by churches that have no documentation of those gatherings in their own preserved minutes and bulletins. The newspaper archive described a version of 1950s Sevierville that simply did not align with any other surviving documentation of that period, as if two parallel versions of the town had existed simultaneously, with the newspaper capturing one reality, while all other institutions recorded something else entirely. The impossibility of James William Cortland's prominence alongside his complete absence from memory extends across at least 47 other individuals who appear regularly in the Sevier County Times throughout the 1950s, always in positions of community leadership, always associated with civic improvement projects, always photographed at public events. Patricia compiled a database of every person mentioned in the newspaper during that decade and cross-referenced those names against census records, property deeds, church membership rolls, school enrollment records, cemetery plots, business licenses, tax assessments, and any other source of documented evidence about who actually lived in Sevierville during those years. The names that appeared most frequently in newspaper coverage showed the weakest correlation with other forms of documentation, while people who rarely made it into the newspaper left extensive paper trails through property ownership, tax payments, organizational memberships, and family records. This inverse relationship suggested that newspaper prominence during the 1950s might have indicated something other than actual community standing, though what that something might be remained unclear until Patricia began examining the specific contexts in which these phantom residents appeared. James William Cortland's 73 headline appearances followed a distinct pattern, with his name surfacing primarily in connection with new construction projects, business expansions, infrastructure improvements, and civic initiatives that required significant capital investment or official approval. A February 1951 article described him as the primary financial backer for a new textile mill on the east side of town, a facility that would supposedly employ 200 workers and represent the largest industrial development in Sevier County history. The newspaper published detailed architectural renderings of the proposed mill, included quotes from Cortland about his commitment to local economic growth, and ran follow-up stories about construction progress over the next 8 months. Property records from that period show the land in question remained undeveloped agricultural acreage throughout the 1950s, with no evidence of industrial construction, no permits filed for such a facility, and no subsequent documentation of any textile manufacturing operation in that location. Similar contradictions surrounded nearly every major project with which Cortland was associated, suggesting that his newspaper presence served a specific function that had nothing to do with actual business activity or community leadership. A June 1953 article celebrated his donation of $10,000 to expand the county library, describing him as a philanthropist committed to educational advancement. Yet library financial records from that year show no such donation, and the expansion project mentioned in the article never occurred. An October 1955 piece identified him as chairman of a committee organizing Sevierville's first official Christmas parade, complete with photographs of him meeting with other committee members to plan the route and select participants. But the town's official records indicate no Christmas parade took place until 1963, and the other people photographed with Cortland in that newspaper image also appear nowhere in census data or property records. The pattern repeated across dozens of instances where Cortland's documented newspaper presence promoted initiatives, projects, or developments that left no trace in any other form of evidence, as if the newspaper was publishing coverage of a planned future that never actually materialized. What made this systematic fabrication particularly unsettling was that the Sevier County Times operated as the community's primary source of local information during an era before television news dominated small-town media consumption, meaning that residents in the 1950s would have read these articles about Cortland and assumed them to be accurate reporting about real events involving real people. The newspaper's credibility rested on its role as a trusted institution, published by the same family for 3 generations, staffed by reporters who lived in the community and attended the same churches and civic organizations as their readers. If that newspaper systematically published false information about major community figures and significant development projects, it suggested a level of coordination between the publication and some other institutional authority that had reasons to present Sevierville's growth trajectory in terms that differed substantially from reality. Patricia's research revealed that the newspaper's phantom residents appeared most frequently during specific windows of time that corresponded with federal funding initiatives, state development programs, and regional planning efforts that required communities to demonstrate certain characteristics to qualify for assistance or investment. The Appalachian Regional Commission, formed in 1965, offered substantial grants to communities that could show organized business leadership and coordinated development planning, but similar though less formalized programs existed throughout the 1950s as part of post-war rural modernization efforts. A town that could point to newspaper coverage of active business leaders, substantial private investment, and ongoing civic improvements stood a better chance of attracting federal attention and resources than a community that appeared stagnant or lacking in local initiative. The Sevier County Times might have created an entire fictional business class and a catalog of phantom development projects to position Sevierville more favorably for external funding opportunities, with James William Cortland serving as a particularly versatile character who could be inserted into whatever narrative the moment required. This hypothesis gained support when Patricia discovered that several other East Tennessee newspapers from the same period contained similar patterns of phantom residents associated with development projects that never materialized, suggesting a regional rather than purely local phenomenon. The Blount County Observer featured a businessman named Robert Ashford Sinclair, who appeared in 41 headlines between 1951 and 1958, always in contexts nearly identical to Cortland's appearances in the Sevier County Times, and who likewise left no trace in census records or property documentation. The Hamblin County Gazette prominently covered the activities of a civic leader named Margaret Elizabeth Hartford, describing her leadership of numerous charitable organizations and community improvement committees, yet no evidence of her existence survived outside those newspaper articles. The consistent pattern across multiple publications in the same geographic region during the same time period implied coordination at a level beyond individual editorial decisions, perhaps involving state development agencies that provided templates or guidelines for how local newspapers should present their communities to external evaluators. The most disturbing aspect of this coordinated fabrication emerged when Patricia attempted to interview former reporters and editors who had worked for the Sevier County Times during the 1950s, only to discover that none of the bylines appearing on articles about James William Cortland and other phantom residents match the names of people who actually held reporting positions at the newspaper during that period. The publication's staff records, preserved in the archives of the Tennessee Press Association, showed a newsroom of 4 reporters and 1 editor throughout the 1950s, with their names appearing on most articles published during that decade. But articles about Cortland and the other 47 phantom residents carried different bylines, names that appeared nowhere in the newspaper's employment records and nowhere in Sevierville's residential documentation from that era. The phantom residents had been covered by phantom reporters, creating a complete parallel universe of civic life that existed only in print while leaving no footprint in any other dimension of documented reality. When Patricia finally located Arthur Henderson, the 92-year-old son of the newspaper's editor during the 1950s, she expected he might provide insight into why the publication had engaged in systematic fabrication of community news and how such an elaborate deception had been coordinated. Instead, Henderson described his father as a man of uncompromising journalistic integrity who had operated the Sevier County Times according to strict ethical standards and who had never, to Henderson's knowledge, published anything he knew to be false. The old man spent 2 hours looking through the newspaper clippings Patricia had brought, examining photographs of his father standing alongside James William Cortlandt at various civic events, reading articles with his father's name in the masthead that covered Cortlandt's business ventures and community involvement. He recognized his father in the photographs, confirmed the signature and writing style in the articles as authentic, acknowledged that the newspaper's production values and layout matched his memories of the publication from that era, yet maintained that he had never heard of James William Cortlandt and could not explain how his father had been photographed with someone who apparently never existed. Henderson's confusion mirrored the reaction Patricia had received from every other elderly Sevierville resident she interviewed, people who should have been children or teenagers during the 1950s, and who should have at least ambient memories of the town's most prominent businessman if he had actually existed as the newspaper described. Instead, she encountered a consistent void where those memories should have been, combined with an inability to reconcile that void with the extensive documentation of Cortlandt's presence. Some people suggested she must have confused Sevierville with another town, that perhaps the microfilm archive contained pages from a different newspaper that had been misfiled. Others proposed that Cortlandt might have been a pseudonym used by someone who wanted to make charitable donations anonymously, though this explanation failed to account for the photographs or the fact that the donations themselves appeared never to have actually occurred. A few elderly residents became visibly uncomfortable when shown the newspaper clippings, exhibiting the kind of distress associated with encountering evidence that contradicts fundamental assumptions about reality, but none could offer any explanation for the discrepancy between printed record and living memory. The investigation took a darker turn when Patricia discovered that several of the other phantom residents had supposedly died in accidents or from sudden illnesses during the late 1950s, with their obituaries in the Sevier County Times providing detailed accounts of their lives, accomplishments, and community contributions. The death notices described funeral services at specific churches, burial in identified cemeteries, and surviving family members, yet the churches had no record of those services in their logbooks. The cemeteries contained no corresponding graves, and the surviving family members named in the obituaries did not appear in any genealogical records. One particularly elaborate obituary from August 1958 mourned the loss of Thomas Edward Brightwell, describing him as a beloved hardware store owner who had served on the city council for 12 years and who died at age 57 from a heart attack. The newspaper published a photograph of his storefront, included testimonials from supposed colleagues praising his civic dedication, and detailed his funeral arrangements. Property records show no hardware store at the address mentioned. City council minutes contain no mention of anyone named Brightwell serving in any capacity, and the cemetery supposedly containing his grave has no plot under that name, or any burial record from August 1958 matching the description provided. These phantom deaths suggested something more complex than simple fabrication for economic development purposes, because there was no obvious benefit to inventing deceased community members or creating false obituaries for people who had never existed. The obituaries appeared to serve a different function, perhaps providing closure for a fictional narrative that needed to be retired, perhaps documenting the end of a program or initiative that had used these phantom identities for purposes that became unnecessary or inadvisable as the decade drew to a close. The concentration of phantom deaths in 1958 and 1959 coincided with the end of several federal development programs that had operated during the Eisenhower administration and the beginning of new approaches to rural economic policy that would characterize the Kennedy years. If the phantom residents had been created to help Sevierville qualify for specific types of assistance or to present a particular image to external evaluators, their utility might have ended when those programs concluded and different criteria for federal support emerged. Patricia's most significant breakthrough came when she obtained access to the Tennessee State Planning Commission archives, held at the University of Tennessee, where she discovered internal memoranda from the 1950s discussing strategies for improving how rural Appalachian communities presented themselves in applications for federal development funding. One memo from March 1953 explicitly recommended that county newspapers work with local officials to highlight private sector investment and entrepreneurial activity, even in cases where such activity was aspirational rather than currently occurring, on the theory that documented optimism and forward planning would impress federal reviewers more effectively than accurate reporting about current economic conditions. Another memo from June 1955 suggested that communities create promotional narratives about civic leadership and organize development initiatives regardless of whether those narratives reflected actual organizational capacity, arguing that federal agencies responded more favorably to communities that appeared to have internal momentum, rather than those presenting themselves as entirely dependent on external assistance. These memos stopped short of explicitly instructing newspapers to fabricate people or events, but the language clearly encouraged a malleable relationship with factual accuracy in service of securing resources for communities that desperately needed economic development. The Sevier County Times appears to have interpreted these guidelines broadly, creating not just optimistic narratives about real people and actual initiatives, but an entire fictional framework of business leadership and civic organization that existed purely for external consumption. James William Cortland and the 47 other phantom residents served as characters in an ongoing promotional story about a community positioning itself for growth, with the newspaper functioning less as a journalistic institution and more as a public relations apparatus coordinating with state and possibly federal authorities who understood the game being played. What makes this arrangement particularly chilling is that ordinary Sevierville residents reading their local newspaper during the 1950s had no way to distinguish between accurate coverage of their actual neighbors and fabricated coverage of phantom residents, meaning they lived in an information environment where their primary source of community knowledge was systematically unreliable in ways they couldn't detect. The question of why these phantom residents left no trace in living memory requires considering how collective memory actually forms in small American towns, where social networks remain relatively stable and intergenerational transmission of knowledge happens through both formal institutions and informal family storytelling. If James William Cortland never actually walked through downtown Sevierville, never attended church services, never had children who went to the local schools, never participated in the genuine social fabric of the community, then there was nothing for memory to preserve beyond the newspaper articles that created his existence. The people who did attend those church services and whose children did go to those schools would have their own direct experiences forming the foundation of what they remembered, and those experiences simply wouldn't include Cortland because he existed only in print. The newspaper created a documentary record without creating the underlying reality that such records normally describe, leaving future researchers like Patricia to discover the gap between what was supposedly happening in Sevierville during the 1950s and what actually occurred in the lived experience of its residents. What remains unexplained is why the phantom residents appeared so frequently in photographs with real people, whose existence can be verified through multiple independent sources, creating images that show Tennessee state officials, actual Sevierville business owners, documented church leaders, and confirmed civic organizers standing alongside individuals who left no trace in any record except those specific newspaper photographs. Arthur Henderson's father, the newspaper editor, appears in several such photographs with James William Cortland, both men dressed in the formal attire typical of civic events during that era, both looking directly at the camera with expressions appropriate to whatever occasion was being documented. Either these photographs were somehow fabricated using techniques sophisticated enough to fool modern analysis, or James William Cortland and the other phantom residents did physically exist in some form during the moments when these images were captured, even if they left no other evidence of their presence in Sevierville. Patricia sent several of the clearest photographs to forensic imaging specialists who examine historical photographs for authenticity and evidence of manipulation, and their analysis revealed no indication of composite images, retouching, or other forms of analog fabrication that would have been available in the 1950s. The photographs appeared to be authentic representations of the scenes they depicted, showing real people standing together at real events, captured on film in real time. This finding forced a reconsideration of what it meant for someone to be a phantom resident, because if Cortland and the others had been physically present at these documented occasions, while simultaneously leaving no trace in property records, census data, or living memory, it suggested they existed in some liminal category between full participation in community life and complete absence from it. Perhaps they were federal agents or state officials operating under constructed identities, for purposes related to monitoring or managing the development programs their fictional personas helped Sevierville access, present just enough to be photographed, but not enough to leave the normal residue of extended residence in a small town. This possibility gained some support from the discovery that several other Appalachian communities that received substantial federal development funding during the 1950s also featured newspaper coverage of prominent local business leaders who could not be verified through independent documentation, suggesting a coordinated program operating across the region. The Wise County Banner in Virginia ran dozens of articles about a developer named Charles Robertson Hammond, who supposedly led multiple coal industry modernization projects, yet no evidence of Hammond exists outside those newspaper articles. The Pike County Register in Kentucky extensively covered the activities of Eleanor Francine Mitchell, described as a pioneering female entrepreneur who operated several successful retail businesses, though neither Mitchell nor her businesses appear in any Kentucky state business records from that period. The pattern repeated in West Virginia, North Carolina, and throughout the areas that would later be formally designated as the Appalachian region, requiring special federal attention and resources. If federal agencies or state planning commissions deployed personnel to rural communities under constructed identities, using them as visible symbols of local business vitality and civic organization, while keeping their actual roles and affiliations confidential, it would explain both their presence in newspaper coverage and photographs as well as their absence from normal documentation. These individuals would need to be present at public events to be photographed and to lend credibility to the newspaper's coverage of local development initiatives, but they wouldn't establish permanent residence, wouldn't purchase property, wouldn't enroll children in schools, wouldn't join churches or civic organizations in ways that would create lasting documentation. They would function as theatrical performers in a coordinated production designed to help struggling rural communities present themselves more favorably to federal reviewers, appearing when needed for specific events, and then departing before their presence would require the kind of sustained social integration that leaves permanent traces. The ethical implications of such a program, if it existed, remain deeply troubling even 7 decades after the fact, because it suggests federal authorities determined that Appalachian communities couldn't access needed resources through honest representation of their actual conditions and capacities. Instead of designing assistance programs that met communities where they actually were, the system apparently incentivized or even facilitated elaborate performances of entrepreneurial vitality and organized civic leadership that had no connection to reality. Communities like Sevierville spent the 1950s trying to convince external evaluators they possessed resources and capabilities they didn't actually have, burning energy and attention on maintaining fictional narratives instead of addressing genuine needs. The phantom residents represented not just individual fabrications, but a broader institutional failure that treated rural poverty and underdevelopment as public relations problems, requiring better storytelling, rather than structural challenges requiring sustained investment. Patricia's research ultimately documented the phantom resident phenomenon across 43 different East Tennessee communities, finding similar patterns of newspaper coverage describing business leaders and civic organizers who left no trace in census records or property documentation, suggesting a regional program of coordinated fabrication that operated throughout the 1950s. She submitted her findings to several academic journals specializing in Appalachian history and 20th century rural development policy, only to face rejection based on reviewers' concerns that her conclusions implied an implausibly large-scale conspiracy without sufficient evidence of coordination between federal agencies and local newspapers. The academic response treated her discovery as impossible despite the documentary evidence she had compiled, preferring to dismiss the pattern as coincidental gaps in record-keeping rather than acknowledge the systematic nature of the fabrication. This institutional resistance to recognizing what the archives clearly showed forced Patricia to consider that the phantom resident program might have been informal rather than officially documented, operating through verbal instructions and shared understandings that left no paper trail for historians to later uncover. She expanded her investigation beyond East Tennessee, examining newspaper archives and census records from rural communities across Kentucky, West Virginia, and North Carolina, discovering that the phantom resident pattern extended throughout areas that received targeted federal development assistance during the 1950s. The consistency was striking, with newspapers in economically struggling communities systematically publishing coverage of local business leaders who appeared nowhere in official records, while newspapers in more prosperous areas showed much higher correlation between their coverage of community figures and those individuals' presence in census data and property documentation. The pattern suggested that phantom residents appeared specifically in communities that needed to demonstrate economic vitality they didn't possess to qualify for assistance programs, while communities that actually had that vitality didn't need to fabricate it. The federal development system of the 1950s had apparently created incentives that made institutional dishonesty a rational strategy for desperately poor rural areas, then punished those same communities by forcing them to maintain elaborate fictions instead of acknowledging their genuine challenges. The final disturbing detail in Patricia's investigation came when she attempted to interview descendants of the real Sevierville residents who had been photographed with James William Cortland and other phantom residents at various civic events during the 1950s, hoping these families might have preserved personal photographs or memories that could clarify the nature of those interactions. Several families responded with unexpected hostility, insisting that Patricia was spreading false information about their relatives and demanding she cease her research. One woman whose grandfather appeared in a 1956 photograph standing beside Cortland at a Rotary Club meeting threatened legal action if Patricia published anything suggesting her grandfather had participated in any kind of deception or fabrication. This defensive reaction implied that some families understood more about the phantom resident program than they were willing to acknowledge publicly, protecting their ancestors' reputations by denying any knowledge of something they suspected might be shameful if fully exposed. The few family members willing to speak with Patricia off the record described a pervasive atmosphere during the 1950s in which everyone understood that certain aspects of public life involved performance rather than genuine substance, that newspaper coverage didn't always reflect reality, that civic leaders sometimes participated in coordinated presentations designed for external audiences rather than local consumption. One elderly man whose father had served as county commissioner during the period when phantom residents appeared most frequently in local coverage described coming across newspaper clippings in his father's papers that showed the commissioner at events the son had no memory of his father attending, raising questions about whether some of the photographs might have been staged specifically for newspaper publication rather than documenting actual gatherings. The implication was that real Sevierville residents understood they were participating in a kind of communal theater, showing up to be photographed with phantom colleagues to create evidence of civic vitality and organized development planning that would help their struggling community access federal resources. This widespread complicity in maintaining the fiction would explain why James William Cortland and the other phantom residents left no trace in living memory, despite their extensive newspaper coverage, because people who knowingly participated in creating false documentation about their community's business leadership wouldn't later share memories of those fabricated figures with their children and grandchildren. The phantom residents would be deliberately forgotten as soon as they served their purpose, erased from family stories and local folklore as part of the same coordinated effort that had created them in the first place. What looked to Patricia like an impossible gap between documentary record and collective memory might actually represent a successful campaign of intentional forgetting, with multiple generations of Sevierville residents working to ensure that the shameful compromises of the 1950s didn't contaminate their descendants' understanding of their community's history. Sevierville today operates as a gateway community to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, its economy driven almost entirely by tourism and dominated by businesses that cater to the millions of annual visitors passing through on their way to Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge, and very few current residents know anything about the phantom residents who once populated their local newspaper during an earlier era when the town desperately needed to appear more prosperous and organized than it actually was. The microfilm archives in the courthouse basement preserve that elaborate fiction, frozen in the kind of documentary permanence that normally indicates reliability, creating an ironic situation where the least trustworthy source about 1950s Sevierville remains the most detailed and accessible. Researchers who want to understand what life was actually like in the community during that period have to read past the phantom residents, mentally subtracting an entire category of supposedly prominent citizens from the historical record, while knowing that the real story of struggle and need and coordinated institutional deception will never be fully recoverable, because the people who understood what was happening chose silence over documentation. Patricia Hendricks stopped her research in 2022 after receiving communications she described as threatening, though she wouldn't specify their content or origin except to say they came from people who didn't want certain questions about Appalachian development programs to receive public attention. Her database of phantom residents, compiled across 3 years of archive work and containing detailed documentation of similar patterns in 43 different communities, remains unpublished and inaccessible to other researchers. The academic journals that rejected her work never explained why they found coordinated fabrication involving multiple newspapers across multiple states less plausible than coincidental record-keeping failures affecting hundreds of individuals in the same systematic pattern. The descendants of real Sevierville residents who participated in creating the phantom resident fiction continue to deny any knowledge of the program and to resist efforts to examine what their community did during the desperate years before tourism transformed the local economy. What survives is James William Cortland's face in 73 newspaper photographs, always wearing the same dark suit and thin mustache, always standing in groups with real people at real events, always described as a pillar of the community and a leader in local development efforts, and always absent from every other form of evidence about who actually lived in Sevierville during the 1950s, existing in that impossible space between documented presence and complete non-existence. A reminder that sometimes the official record preserves not what happened, but what a struggling community needed outsiders to believe was happening, and that sometimes the truth about American small towns gets sacrificed to systems that demanded performance over honesty, leaving us with archives full of people who never were, and the uncomfortable knowledge that institutional memory can be as fabricated as anything else. Subscribe now so you don't miss our next investigation into the American communities where the past exists only in forms nobody can trust.